Well, thank you very much. I'm going to look around just for grins here. I just wanted to see that. Yeah, that's great. I love that. I've been in a lot of venues in my life. I average about 150 a year for the last 30 years, but I think this may be the coolest one that I've ever been in, and so I really like that. And anything that makes a guy like me seem tall is especially gratifying. Yeah. Ooh. No, I remember. No, I remember one time I was giving a speech. This was back in the 80s during the last financial crisis to the East Texas Bankers Association over in Henderson, Texas, which was not far from where I grew up. And as many of you remember, 1985 was not a particularly good time to be a banker in East Texas, but we had a good time. When the speech was over, this very, very, very attractive young lady came up to me and just threw her arms around me and just hugged me, and she was just all excited. She said, "Dr. Perryman, that's great, that's wonderful. I think that's the best speech I've ever heard." Well, I don't get that very often. I've been doing this 30 years and it's happened once, okay? so I'm doing this. I'm trying to look 5'7", and I'm stretching on up there. And she said, "Listen, could I possibly have your notes for a souvenir?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to give them to you, but I don't use notes because I don't leave evidence behind about what I've said." And, and she said, "Well, do you think I could have a transcript?" And I said, "Well, I'll ask around, but I didn't see anybody make a transcript. I don't think there's one." And she said, "Well, what about a cassette?" which was the technology of the day. And I said, "Well, again, I can check around, but I don't think there was a cassette." And she said, "Well, what about a video? Surely I can have a video." Well, back in those days, now some of you could have cell phones out and I wouldn't even know it. You could be recording this. But back in those days, if there was a video, it was a big camera. And so I said, "Well, I know there wasn't a video because I would have seen the camera, and I'm sorry there's not a video." Well, by this time, as flattered as I was getting a little tired of this on and on and on. She finally said, "Let me ask you one more question. Is there any chance whatsoever that this speech might be published?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know, maybe posthumously." And she says, "Man, I hope that's real soon." But I'm still here, what can I say? And I'll tell one more quick story on myself, another true story. And the reason I'm still here is because although I could stand to drop a few pounds right now, those of you who've known me as long as Jerry Conner and John Crutchfield know that I used to weigh a whole lot more than I weigh now. And back in 1996, I started, my wife encouraged me to get on a program. I don't know why my cholesterol was only 492, but my ratio was bad, And so, but anyway, she encouraged me to get on a diet and all that. When right before that happened, I was like and she was still mayor of Odessa at the time, and I was like the biggest I'd ever been. And by the way, I was 43. If you're trying to do the math, I'm 56 now. But I was 43. That's a great time to start exercising, because all my friends who had been jocks all their lives, by the time they were 43, they had a bad knee or a bad back or shoulder or elbow or something. I had virgin muscles. Man, they had never been used, and I was ready to go. So, but anyway, just before I lost weight, I was like the biggest I'd ever been. I walked into Whataburger on 42nd Street in Odessa, and I ordered my usual. And it's embarrassing how much I could eat back then. My usual was 2 triple triples, 2 large fries, large onion rings, 2 apple pies, a jumbo chocolate shake, and a jumbo Diet Coke. Okay? Yeah. Yeah, the Diet Coke was for balance. You have to keep these things in perspective. Well, there's a little boy behind me in line, one of these kids just cannot stop talking. And he looks up at his dad, and he says, "Daddy, is he really going to eat all that?" Well, the man's face turns red, and he says, "Son, leave the man alone. It's his business. He can eat whatever he wants to." Well, then he whispered, but it's one of those concrete floors with the weird acoustics. I mean, you could hear him everywhere. He's like, "Daddy, is he really going to eat all that?" And he said, "Son, please, that's Dr. Perryman. He's in the, he's got a column. He's in the newspaper. His wife's the mayor. Now, you're really embarrassing me. Please be quiet." Well, about that time, I happened to be wearing the technology of that day. Some of you remember 1996 digital pagers. I had a digital pager on my belt. Went off at just that moment. Went beep, beep, beep. The boy said, "Watch out, Daddy. He's backing up." True story, I promise. I'll try not to back up too much today, but I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Things like this are so important. It's so important that communities work hard and pull together in times like this, and for the leadership to come together of multiple generations, because that's what it really takes to keep a community going in times like this. But what I'm going to try to do first, and then I'll talk more about the local area and that sort of thing, but the question I'm asked most now, and as some of you know, I wrote a book on the 80s a few years ago, and then way back a long time before that, I wrote a book on the Federal Reserve. And so as a result of that, I get pulled in anytime there's a mess like this. I get called in and have to kind of get involved in it. I've been in Washington for the past 10 days day before yesterday, I guess. And I'll be back up there in a couple of weeks, and in Chicago a couple of times in between. So it's there's a lot going on right now. But what I'm going to try to do is, in very plain, simple English, try to tell you what's going on. It was mentioned to you, you're getting it through the media, and sometimes it's not as accurate as it should be, and other times they just don't stop and explain it, and they make it too complicated. And frankly, I think it's because a lot of times they don't understand it. But let me do the best I can here to try to kind of give you a sense of what has happened and how we got here and what it means going forward. For a moment, let me get you to use your imagination a little bit. Since we're in a wonderful place of imagery like this. Think of a country, try to imagine a country that's the strongest country in the world. Biggest economy, leads the world in world trade, leads the world in new science and technology, even arts and culture. I mean, everything. It is the envy of the world for its overall fundamental economic strength. And then it gets all tied up in a single asset. Okay, my BlackBerry's off, so that's somebody else's. Okay. It gets tied up in a single asset, and everybody thinks they have to have one. You know, they absolutely have to have one of these things. And people who've never had one before have to have one. And people who can't afford one have to have one. And so all the big financial institutions figure out ways people can get it that shouldn't have it. And they figure out ways to sell that off and recirculate the money and get somebody else to have one. And they keep bidding it up and bidding it up and bidding it up, and then it collapses. Does that sound a little bit familiar? You didn't have to do too much imagination to get there, did you? Well, the country was Holland. The asset was tulips. And the year was 1637. And about every 10 years since then, we have managed to speculate wildly in something. The most recent one before this last mess was probably the dot-com stocks. It wasn't that long ago we were all revved up about dot-com stocks and drove the NASDAQ up above 5,000 for a few minutes. And so, you know, we always tend to do that. What is happening is the world is getting so complex and so integrated with all the modern technology and everything so tied together, we just have a real ability to screw things up a lot more than we used to. And we really used it this time. To kind of give you a sense of really how this one started, I won't go back to 1637, but let me go back about 20 years, 24 years, about mid-80s. There were a few people at major universities around the country. The one that gets the most publicity is a guy named Gary Gorton from Yale, but there were several folks around at major universities, economist types, who decided they could be smarter than it's possible to be. Okay? Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you know how the physicists tell us, as smart as physicists are, and they figure out all this stuff about the universe and how everything works and all the little micro particles and all that. It's fascinating. I love to talk to these guys when I get a chance. They cannot tell you the position and momentum of a particle or any object at the same time. They can tell you the position, they can tell you the momentum, they can't tell you both at the same time. You know, I mean, there's just a certain amount of uncertainty in the world, period. Well, when you start trying to apply that to economics and the way humans act, you get a whole lot more uncertainty. But that didn't stop these guys. What they decided they could do was build models that would let them buy assets in such a way that they could earn a return with absolutely no risk. Now think about that. It doesn't matter how small the return is. If you could earn a return with absolutely no risk, it's like a perpetual motion machine. You create an infinite amount of wealth if you could really do that. And you can't. But they thought they could. And here's how they would do it. They would buy an asset, a bond of some sort. And as soon as they bought it, they would buy